It is with great conviction that I've come to the conclusion that a society without an organized belief system is a society lost in morality and ethical principles. As a former agnostic bordering atheist, I found myself solely focused on the science, driven by the debunking of literal biblical context, and in the process discrediting any and all meaning or wisdom to be gained from a theological perspective. After all, what credibility do belief systems centered around a deity whose existence could not be proven hold? Or so I thought. Through much of my younger adult years, I was convinced that science and religion clashed because they were contradictory in nature. Evolution and creation, evidence and faith could not occur simultaneously. I've come to the realization that my perspective was not only wrong, but very limited, as I witnessed the unraveling of our society through the fragmentation into scattered ideological principles centered predominantly around overindulgent and self-destructive behaviors. I am convinced that in addition to abandoning a universal moral code in the adoption of the modernized secular worldview, there is another major flaw in contemporary ideologies. Humans are hierarchical in nature, and without an authority to submit to, humans are prone to engage in activities with likely unfavorable outcomes because of our self-destructive nature. This is prominent when there are no deterrents in the legalities of said activities. After all, laws wouldn't be necessary if humanity operated in its own best interest. It is with this that I contend with, because what governments lack in legislation, and with good reason to avoid tyranny, biblical principles compensated for in the form of self-governance. Throughout history, humanity has proven unreliable in self-accountability without the presence of some level of reinforcement or repercussion. This is evident in everything ranging from failed New Year's resolutions to infidelity, both of which fall into a vast pool of seemingly limitless examples. Humans will obey the law but break commitments. They will show up daily to a job they dread, but neglect their physical health by failing to show up to the gym. This, in my opinion, is because the consequences are clearly defined by the authority of man for one, and we've abandoned God's laws for self-governance on the other, and worse, have justified the lack of self-accountability on many occasions, an example being the biblical warning against the cardinal sin of gluttony, and providing instruction for honoring your body as God's temple, while certain ideologues would not only condone the lack of self-governance, they would justify it as inclusiveness and label any opposition as fat-shaming, irrespective of potential health complications. In 1952, in a letter to Coretta Scott, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote that man is a sinner and that even if he is given better economic and social conditions, he will still be a sinner until he submits his life to the grace of God. Ultimately, our problem is a theological one. I agree with Dr. King, and his writings hold true even in the most controversial of topics, such as abortion, in which governing bodies fight to provide choices to mitigate undesirable outcomes but fail to address the fundamental problem. It is, of course, in the best interest of citizens to retain a sense of autonomy, but in a degenerate world, we've abandoned the very principles that have allowed us to successfully self-govern free from the grasp of tyrannical governments. As a result of our fragmented secular principles, we've convinced ourselves that engaging in self-indulgent behaviors that in many cases lead to undesirable outcomes is somehow liberating from the metaphorical shackles of delayed gratification. After all, with consenting adults, what other motive than indulgence serves to justify sexual intercourse with a non-committed partner? When psychological studies show no correlation between sexual promiscuity and happiness, and the risk of undesirable outcomes are evident, the act in itself is hardly justifiable and indicative of a misled society. The end result is that we are now resorting to unthinkable mitigation efforts for failure to recognize the repercussions of our actions. Granted, this does not reflect every case, but statistical findings supporting today's culture can hardly be challenged. But because we've abandoned our principles and have allowed such matters to become politicized, what I view as a band-aid attempting to cover a very deep wound now operates under the guise of women's reproductive rights or pro-choice. Whether or not this is oppressive to women is, in my opinion, not the issue, and the matter certainly has no place in politics. Rather, the solution, just like for many other matters, has always been found not in man's law, but in God's. In this particular case, to simply save oneself for a committed partner under the sanctity of marriage. Admittedly, these examples aren't applicable to all, but the prevalence of a godless culture and its correlation to a crippling society is irrefutable. It is for this reason why I no longer undermine the importance of adopting a biblical worldview. What I once viewed as ignorance, I judged through the lens of arrogance. Where I once focused on the minutia, I now see the bigger picture. Scientific findings should not serve to discredit the guidance provided in Scripture simply because it provides answers to what was once inexplicable due to the limitations of that time. That would be dangerously naive. A biblical worldview provides something that fragmented ideologies, in my opinion, cannot: the acknowledgement of being a part of something bigger than oneself. Life isn't different to an individual's circumstances. Rather, it's how an individual perceives their circumstances that give them meaning. As humans, none of us are exempt from this. When coupled with our terrible track record of self-governance, is it therefore unreasonable to adopt an historical set of principles that have carried millions of people throughout while providing meaning? I think not. Furthermore, because biblical principle has so widely been adopted as universal truth across religions and denominations, the capacity for it to provide reinforcement of desirable behaviors capable of molding societies and generations is unquestionable. After all, humans are tribalistic in nature, and unifying under a shared belief system would serve as reinforcement in promoting desirable behaviors without running the risks that come with government intervention. While I feel that I've barely begun to scratch the surface in my realization, at the moment I find myself content with my proposed solution. There are those, of course, who will stand in opposition as it pertains to the potential ostracizing of certain lifestyle choices, to which I would reply that I'm neither a fundamentalist or intolerant. My goal, if there is one, is to offer a solution for picking up the shattered pieces of our society by reinstating a worldview that guides us in meaning and in principles of morality.